So the sacrifice for peace, Lelouch and Bushido and Code Geass. So today I'll be analyzing one of the most powerful acts of self-sacrifice in anime, Lelouch v. Britannia's death in Code Geass, Lelouch of the Rebellion. Specifically, I want to examine the event known as the Zero Requiem, which is a carefully planned strategy through which Lelouch intentionally allows himself to be killed in order to create world peace. My argument is that Lelouch's death strongly reflects the philosophies of Bushido, particularly through duty and honor, sacrifice and atonement. However, it is important to distinguish that this is not traditional seppuku. While it shares philosophies similar through ritual suicide in Bushido culture, it does not follow the historical ritual process required to qualify for true seppuku. Instead, Lelouch's death represents a modern form of sacrifice, self-sacrifice specifically, inspired by Bushido ideals, which a leader accepts death in order to restore moral balance for a greater good, typically to protect the future of others or society. To understand the significance of Lelouch's sacrifice, you kind of need to understand the context, which leads to the Zero Requiem. Through the series, Lelouch leads a rebellion against the Britannian Empire, which his supernatural power called gaze. He manipulates events and commands others in order to overthrow oppressive systems. However, his rebellion causes massive political instability and just overall chaos, which creates a bigger issue for the rest of everyone else. By the end of the series, Lelouch becomes the emperor and gains control over almost the whole world's political powers. He instead rules as a tyrant, so Lelouch intentionally portrays himself as a cruel tyrant. He governs through fear, oppression, and ultimately he just wants to have that ruling authority to command everyone. So he's seen as a villain, and however this image is deliberate. Lelouch secretly collaborates with his former enemy and friend to execute a long-term plan. And the purpose of this plan is to create a single villain that the entire world can unite against, allowing hatred and conflict between nations to be more redirected towards someone, and that one person would be Lelouch. The motivation why Lelouch chooses this fate is the decision of sacrifice himself is motivated by several important factors. So he has that deep guilt over the destruction caused by the rebellion, and many innocent people died during the wars he initiated. Secondly, Lelouch wants to create a peaceful world for his younger sister, who represents more of that innocent side and hope for the future. So you see that character development in different sides. Thirdly, he realizes that the world endless cycle of war cannot end unless there's that dramatic moment that reshapes global politics. Lelouch believes that the only way to unite humanity is through that shared enemy, so he chooses to become that enemy himself. This reflects the key element of Bushido philosophy, which is that atonement through sacrifice. Instead of escaping responsibility for the harm he caused, Lelouch accepts the only true way to restore balance is through his own death. The act of it is more the Zero Requiem. So the Zero Requiem takes place during the public parade celebrating Lelouch's rule of empire. As he rides through the crowd, the masked hero Zero suddenly appears and attacks him. The crowd believes that Zero is the heroic revolutionary who has returned to stop the tyrant empire. However, that's pretty far from what was actually going on. The person inside the Zero costume is actually Suzaku, which I talked about earlier, was his former enemy, so Lelouch's closest ally in the plan. He then publicly kills Lelouch in front of the entire world. So Lelouch does not resist this. He accepts death calmly, knowing that the plan has succeeded. From the world's perspective, the Tyrant Empire has finally been defeated by a hero. The moment symbolically ends the era of war and tyranny because the world unites in relief and celebration. That global conflict finally begins to subside. So does this qualify as seppuku? At this point, it's important to evaluate whether Lelouch's death qualifies. And historically, seppuku is a very specific ritual practiced by samurai. It involves the cutting of the abdomen, an act of that ritual suicide, often performed after careful preparation. And Lelouch's death does not follow this ritual structure. There is no ceremonial preparation, no abdominal cutting, and no formal samurai ritual. Instead, Lelouch dies by being stabbed by Suzaku during a public assassination. Therefore, it would be historically incorrect to call this seppuku. However, the act will strongly reflect the spirit of Bushido, particularly the ideas of honorable sacrifice and responsibility for one's actions. Bushido philosophy and Lelouch's sacrifice. Several Bushido principles are clearly reflected in Lelouch's final act. That duty Lelouch believes is his responsibility, and by sacrificing himself, he fulfills what he sees as his duty to the world. Honor-wise, even though the world will remember him as a villain, Lelouch restores moral balance through this sacrifice. In Bushido philosophy, honor is sometimes achieved through that accepting death for the greater good. And finally, atonement. His death functions as punishment for the destruction he caused. And instead of avoiding responsibility, he willingly accepts those consequences that he had caused through this whole process. So that shows the selflessness of him sacrificing his life, but also his reputation. Sorry, I got a little distracted. So I want to talk about the evidence now. One of the most revealing quotes from Lelouch appears earlier in the series when he says, "The only one who should kill are those prepared to be killed." This statement reflects Lelouch's moral philosophy. He believes that anyone who takes lives must also be willing to accept death as the consequence of their actions. So by the end of this series, he fully commits to this belief. When Suzaku kills him, Lelouch does not resist or attempt to escape, which is the main part of why this is considered that major sacrifice. That calm acceptance of death demonstrates that he understands what he's doing. And the outcome of Zero Requiem after Lelouch's death, the effects of the Zero begin to appear, and the world unites against that memory of Lelouch's tyranny. The masked hero Zero becomes a global symbol for justice and hope throughout this series, and conflicts between nations kind of dissolve. But more importantly, back when I discussed how that character development, you can see the other side of him because he had that soft spot for his sister. His sister is able to live in that peaceful world keep her innocence, and this means Lelouch ultimately achieves the goal he intended. And this is all through that honor and sacrifice. So in conclusion, Lelouch's death is, in the Code Geass, represents a powerful example of self-sacrifice inspired by Bushido philosophy. While the act does not qualify as traditional seppuku, it strongly reflects Bushido ideals such as that duty, honor, and atonement, all shown through his selfless acts. By intentionally becoming the villain of the world and accepting death, Lelouch transforms his own destruction into a tool for peace. And his sacrifice demonstrates that leadership sometimes requires willingness to bear hatred, accept responsibility, and ultimately do something for the greater good. And for this reason, the Zero Requiem remains one of the most impactful portrayals of that sacrificial honor in anime, and truly demonstrates that true leadership sometimes requires more for the greater good. Thank you. Bye.